Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first EU Health Governance Research Network event of 2023. Just a little bit about the network. EU Health Governance is funded by University Association for Contemporary European Studies between 2021 and 2024. Coordinators are Dr. Eleanor Brooks from Edinburgh University, Dr. Charlotte Brzezowski from City University London, and myself, Dr. Mary Guy of Liverpool John Moores University. We're an interdisciplinary network. Our focus is broadly on political science, sociology, and law. And as a network, we host various events. This is our second panel discussion, but we also host in-conversation events with academics to discuss the latest research in the area of EU health, broadly understood. And we've also been fortunate to incorporate practitioner perspectives from Brussels, from colleagues at EFA and EuroHealthNet. So if you're not following us on Twitter already, do keep an eye on our Twitter feed and on our website for upcoming events this year. But today our focus is on pharmaceutical activity. I will just need to go to slides. Oops. So today our focus is on pharmaceutical activity, and we're thinking in terms also of challenges arising from the pharmaceutical strategy and beyond. So in thinking about how EU activity in connection with pharmaceuticals has developed over time, how it's been shaped, a starting point is typically identified as responses to the thalidomide crises in the 1960s, which raised questions about marketing authorization and the need for harmonization of national standards. Over time, other considerations have come to light, for example, in the 1970s regarding commercialization of pharmaceuticals. And over time, what's become evident is that pharmaceuticals are typically regarded as a kind of special case or a difficult case. We see reference to this as a special case in the 1985 Commission White Paper and the 1988 Cecchini Report. And also this time with the Single European Act 1986, we see, as Permanent and others have noted, that the 1992 deadline for the internal market was instrumental in developing pharma under the auspices of the internal market rather than in connection with public health. So that set up a sort of tension that sort of persists to this day of the location of pharma. With regard to the pharma life cycle, Hans has talked about regulatory and market pathways, and this too shapes the development and work in this area. The regulatory pathway relates to the authorization of marketing of new products in accordance with strict criteria on safety, quality, and efficacy. And market pathway relates to prices and conditions for the purchase of products at a national level. Over time, we've seen an expansion of the legal and policy framework, but generally it's been considered recently in the last couple of years by Hervé and de Ruyter that EU pharma policy is characterised less by broad brush legislation and more by various non-legislative regulatory measures which are subject to technocratic decision-making within agencies, expert committees, or standard-setting bodies. So that's setting up some of the dynamics that we see when we start to think about EU activity with regard to pharmaceuticals. Well, recently, we've had the EU pharmaceutical strategy. Of course, 2020 will forever be characterised by the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the EU's responses in publishing a suite of measures in late 2020 was the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe. And taken together, these measures were intended to contribute and are contributing to the development of a European health union. As you can see on the screen, there's an overview that the pharmaceutical strategy is shaped around 4 pillars. So ensuring access to affordable medicines is key, as is supporting competitiveness, innovation and sustainability of the industry. Obviously, in response to COVID-19 and beyond, the need to enhance crisis preparedness and response mechanisms, and last but not least, ensuring a strong EU voice at a global level as well. So the strategy itself includes revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation, generally understood in terms of the 2001 Directive on General Authorization Procedures and the 2004 Regulation on the Centralised Procedure, but also the revision extends to more recent legislation on medicines for orphan drugs and paediatric drugs. And in response to this strategy, various consultation processes have been gone through, and in 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on the strategy. And the Parliament recognised the existence of inequities between member states in accessing healthcare, antimicrobial resistance as a serious health threat, the system of incentives for research and development was something that was no longer fit for purpose, and intellectual property system was also thought to be ineffective. So a range of issues coming out from the European Parliament's perspective there. So a revision of the legislation had been proposed for 2022, but met with various delays. But there are no indications that it's back on the agenda in March 2023, as we see in Commissioner Kyriakides' speech at the EBSCO meeting late last year. And also in the speech, she reaffirmed the pharmaceutical strategy as a crucial building block for the European Health Union. So it's against this backdrop of various dynamics and tensions about where pharmaceuticals are located within EU law and policy more generally, and also in connection with EU, what might be understood as EU health law and policy. Pharmaceuticals have always been perhaps slightly separate, but nevertheless related to health more generally understood. And it's against this backdrop that we offer this discussion today, and I'm delighted to welcome our panel of a range of speakers joining us from across Europe. Dr Aurélie Mahalatchimy is a CNRS permanent researcher at Aix-Marseille University, and her research interests focus on international, European and comparative health law relating to diverse subjects, including biomedical innovation, advanced therapy, medicine, and gene and cell therapy, among other topics. Dr Éloïse Gennet is the junior professor in health law at Aix-Marseille, and Éloïse's research interests encompass clinical trials, research ethics and bioethics, and Éloïse has a special interest in vulnerable groups and their link to notions such as equity, solidarity or inclusiveness. And in 2020, over the period of 2021 to 2022, Aurélie and Éloïse coordinated the thematic network of the BioLaw Interest Group of the European Association for Health Law on health as a fundamental value towards an inclusive and equitable pharmaceutical strategy for the EU. And they'll be telling us more about that shortly. Professor Wolf Sauter is Professor of Law, Markets and Behaviour at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and is also expert in the Competition Directorate of the Dutch Authority for Consumers and Markets. Wolf's research interests, part of the wide-ranging research interests, encompass competition law, including in the healthcare context. And today he will be speaking on the topic of EU competition law and pharmaceuticals, following publication of an edited volume on this with Edward Elgar last year. And our final speaker today will be Dr Katrina Perehudoff, who is Assistant Professor at the University of Amsterdam and a member of the Law Centre for Health and Life. Katrina's research interests focus on the development, implementation and evaluation of law and policy in the field of pharma and public health. And today she'll be talking about the EU pharmaceutical strategy and challenges ahead for the EU's role in global health. So our speakers have been asked to talk for around 15 to 20 minutes on their different themes, and also to perhaps consider some research challenges in the areas as well. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor, first of all, to Dr. Aurélie Mahalatchimy and Dr. Éloïse Gennet.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. So hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank, on behalf of Aurélie, I would like to thank you, Mary, and to thank Eleanor, and to thank the EU Health Governance Research Network for organizing this stimulating event and for inviting us to take part in it. So we will be presenting in tandem today, as we have been coordinating together this thematic network, and today's presentation will draw from this experience and the work we've done on the EU Health Policy Platform. Next slide, please. But first, a little bit more background on who we are, because this thematic network and joint statement is the result of the work within the European Association of Health Law, of the Interest Group on Supranational Biolaw, which is co-chaired by Aurélie Mahalatchimy and Mark Fleer. And as a group, we applied and created a thematic network on the EU Health Policy Platform, which is a space that is managed by DG Santé to foster debate with and between stakeholders. So during a few months, we organized webinars on the platform with the participation of different health stakeholders, and those webinars served as a basis with the feedback from the European Commission to draft in May 2022 a joint statement with the health stakeholders, and some of which also officially endorsed the document with us and with our academic or research institutions. Next slide, please. So our joint statement is entitled Health as a Fundamental Value Towards an Equitable and Inclusive Pharmaceutical Strategy for Europe, because historically the EU pharmaceutical legislation has been built with internal market objectives in mind, yet the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted many loopholes carrying on pre-existing health inequalities. And EU has shown unprecedented solidarity to promote equitable access to medical supplies and COVID-19 vaccines. It has shown how much of an added benefit it can bring to health, and we argue that it should continue to do so beyond health emergencies only and beyond crisis situations. And this shift towards a more patient-centered approach is already visible in the pharmaceutical strategy. And in the joint statement, we have formulated recommendations in that direction as well. And to do so, we have mobilized different strategies, including considerations overlapping between the legal and the political or institutional, but also using the collaboration between academia and health stakeholders to link abstract values and principles to very concrete legal rules or policy actions. Next slide, please. So more than a statement, really turned out to be a research study of the policy and legislation, accompanied by 5 different set of recommendations, some of which are directed to EU institutions and EU member states, and others are also directed more specifically to health stakeholders. So it would be too long to present everything, so we will give just an overview of these 5 main topics. And in the end, we'll insist on 2 elements that will, in our opinion, be determining for the upcoming revision, and that we would like to discuss further with other panelists and with the audience. Next slide, please. So in our first call for action, we have explained how we define vulnerability in a broad manner as a lack of equitable access to adequate medicines, whatever the factors of this vulnerability are, but especially when these factors or their exacerbation could have been avoided or compensated, even only partially, through legal action or policy action. So we recommend to adopt a wide definition of vulnerability and to use it as an indicator to define unmet medical needs and vice versa. But Aurélie will come back to that in the end. So just on a side note, I also wanted to draw your attention on the upcoming recommendation not at the EU level, but at the level of the Council of Europe, because the Steering Committee for Human Rights and Biomedicine in Health just approved last November a first draft recommendation on equitable access to medicinal products in a situation of shortage. Next slide, please. For our second call for action, we have focused on specific incentives model that were targeted in the pharmaceutical strategy, incentives that may be leveraged to promote inclusion of vulnerable groups. It is difficult to summarize our recommendations here as they are quite technical, and I fear it would take too much time to develop each of them. But basically, we have either suggested to add conditions to existing incentives or to create hybrid versions of different models that exist in other legal systems. Next slide, please. I think I'm still on the call one. Could I have the call 3, or am I the only one having call 1 on screen?
I also have
anyway,
call 1.
I'll just keep on. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So in this third call for action, we wanted to focus on digital tools, and in all of the different topics that we've covered, the goal was to identify and analyze determining elements to make sure digital tools are used to fill in the inequality gap rather than widening it, and for instance by generating more digital evidence about otherwise underrepresented groups. So this is a wide topic, and interestingly, a member of our interest group, Dr. Pinlin Lau from Brunel University, created another thematic network this year with Hannah von Kaufschoten from Health Action International, and they're focusing on this topic specifically and going further in the recommendations. Next slide, please. In the fourth call, we have insisted on the necessity to break silos at different levels. So within EU institutions, through the central role of the European Medicines Agency, and most importantly of DG Santé, which we recommend to be even more reinforced to have this leading role through the health and all policies approach, for instance, but maybe in the future, since the recent restructuring of DG Santé, also through the One Health approach, because this One Health approach has been explicitly linked in the new regulation on cross-border health threats to the health and all policies approach, and also explicitly linked in the same recital of the new regulation to the objectives of reducing health inequalities and addressing the challenges of vulnerable groups. Last but not least, we also had a bit on Straight and Global Alliance by using EU external competences, but I think this will be covered in the last presentation today. So I'm not going to say anything more, and I will give the floor to Aurélie.
Thank you, Éloïse. Next slide, please. So in our call 5, the call 5 is related to the promotion of affordability throughout the entire pharmaceuticals life cycle. It is divided through several subtopics. And the first one is transparency, in which we recommended that 180 days delay provided by the Transparency Directive shall be respected. This delay is provided for the national authorities to decide on the pricing and reimbursement for an authorized medicinal product from the submission of a valid application. We also acknowledge the knock-on effect of a lack of transparency across, again, the entire life cycle of pharmaceuticals. We recommend to stipulate and effectively enforce clear and stringent rules on potential conflict of interest, making sure that both experts and policymakers act only in the common interest. We require more cost transparency when filling the marketing authorization documentation, with the deposit of the financial details of research and development costs, and then for pharmaceutical companies to better communicate on and coordinate their market launch and continued commercialization of pharmaceuticals. And finally, we highlighted the need to take into account only good quality individual patient data within the regulatory decision making in medicine. Next slide, please. Then another topic we covered was research funding, where we highlight the need to better communicate on public financial incentive, both at the European Union and national levels, and even maybe more importantly, to link public funding to increased requirement of equitable research benefits for patients and return on investment for public funders. Regarding health technology assessment, currently payers are involved only in the way that the exchange of information is directed to them, and we highlighted the need to involve them with all the exchange of information, and also to define them, because it payers relates to different definition according to each EU member state. We also highlight the need to clarify the different procedure at stake, because currently the term joint procedure is used for different existing procedures, some coming only from the coordination group, some coming from the European Medicine Agency and HTA bodies. So there is here a need for clarification on the use of this term, and also on the website of the European Medicine Agency and the EU HTA. We recommend to establish early multi-stakeholder dialogue in the design of pharmaceutical development plans for the generation of data relevant to HTA. And finally, to explore the potential for using HTA to increase financing and affordability with regard to unmet need. Next slide, please. And then regarding competition law and fiscal and social insurance policy, we highlight the need to develop policy and guidance to show how competition law and pharmaceutical regulation can interact and not only be considered as alternative, and to consider the policy option of creating a fund dedicated to the balancing of health insurance systems. And finally, regarding joint procurement agreement, we highlighted the need to promote the use of this agreement for medicine to be considered essential, and to organize joint action to put in place plans to prevent and manage shortages, especially for essential medicines. Next slide, please. So finally, in the joint statement, we really wanted to link general abstract values to concrete norms, so to provide for operational values and principles. And we covered both unmet medical needs, which are more considered within calls 1, 2, and 3, just presented by Éloïse, and unmet health needs, more covered within calls 4 and 5. As long as they are based on medical and social vulnerabilities that need to be considered for equitable availability, accessibility, and affordability of pharmaceuticals. So in that context, we think that two aspects we need particularly to be discussed, especially as they are in between general principles and more concrete rules. And the first one is the definition of unmet medical needs. And the first question is, who will define unmet medical needs? In the joint statement, we said it should be defined in a multi-stakeholder setting. And the work was has already started, and especially in a publication from Vreeman and al. In 2019, where the authors of this publication represented different types of stakeholders, so medicine developers, HTA bodies, patients, regulators, and payers. And in this publication, they not only provide elements of definition or criteria for unmet medical needs, but also key points relating to unmet medical need, and notably the fact for instance, for the regulator to highlight that unmet medical needs are already formally incorporated. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the second aspect and the second question, which is what criteria to define unmet medical needs? There are a set of criteria that have been provided by the European Commission public consultation on the revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation, which are the one you can see on the screen, and regarding the two first criteria, these are the criteria the regulators refer to when they say they are fully incorporated, because the absence of satisfactory treatment authorized in the EU and the major therapeutic advantage over existing treatments are incorporated into the 2006 Commission regulation on conditional marketing authorization. Then regarding the third criterion, the lack of access for patients across the EU to an authorized treatment, we highlighted that authorized treatment should be considered widely, not only to cover marketing authorization pathway, but also other expediting access pathway. Regarding the seriousness of a disease, here again, we consider it should not only cover the overall survival, but also quality of life. And other criteria that could be mentioned are, for instance, related to patient population and incidence, prevalence, or orphan designation. In the joint statement, we highlighted these elements should be considered together, and that they should not be fixed in a set of legislative criteria, because the context is an evolving one regarding science and medicine, and this definition depends on every disease setting. Next slide, please. And the second aspect of the discussion is related to the setting up of a specific EU entity. There are two studies from the European Parliament Science and Technology Option Assessment, so the STOA panel, which provided for two types of an EU entity to be established. The first one is from a study of 2021 regarding whether public infrastructure could overcome market failures. And they propose to establish a public European biomedicine infrastructure to tackle market failures. This infrastructure is, they presented 4 policy options, and these options are based on 2 main choices. The first one is whether the infrastructure will focus on infection diseases, or will have a wider portfolio of research and development projects in several areas that are inadequately covered by the industry. And the second choice is whether there will be outsourcing of research and development projects to external laboratories under procurement mechanism, or if this project will be run mainly in-house within the laboratories of the infrastructure. Then this infrastructure should be distinguished from HERA, but maybe we can discuss that during the discussion. Next slide, please. The second study proposed a European Health Institute, which would be in charge of health research coordination and which would have a leading role in global health. With the idea of having a permanent expertise and research for public health at the European level, and which will advise on health strategies beyond crisis management and participate in the dialogue on global health. And with another main idea being to bring together a regulatory aspect of health research and implementation in healthcare. In our joint statement, we also propose to establish an EU entity within DG Santé, which would have close link with two other agencies, and this entity would be in charge of providing support in advanced therapy medicinal product development, so innovative medicine, in order to bring them from bench to bedside. So the question remain open on what entity with which remit and with which objective do we want or do we need. Next slide, please. And I think that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Aurélie and Éloïse. So now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Wolf Sauter.
Thank you, Mary, and your colleagues for the opportunity to speak here. I'm just waiting for my slides to show up. By way of introduction, I've been active in the enforcement of competition law and pharmaceuticals for about 5 years at the Authority for Consumers and Markets in the Netherlands. Although I've recently moved on to looking at sustainability and competition, as well as digital markets and competition. And as Mary mentioned, I just co-edited a book on the EU competition law and pharmaceuticals that came out last November. My presentation today will be in 4 parts. First, I will have an introduction on the specifics of pharmaceuticals and competition. Then I will discuss the emergence of competition law in pharmaceuticals with a focus on pay for delay, and I'll explain what that means later on. That's about restrictive agreements. Then I'll move on to excessive pricing. That's exploitation of consumers and health systems by dominant undertakings. And finally, I'll conclude on competition and non-competition remedies. Can I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. EU competition law consists of, one back, please.
Oh, sorry.
It's the one with the 4 phases of pharmaceutical competition, yes. EU competition law consists of prohibitions on anti-competitive agreements or cartels and a prohibition on dominance of use. Cartels are agreements between different firms, and dominance of use is typically by a single firm. It also consists of merger control, but that's something I'm not going to go into today. Apart from digital markets, pharmaceutical markets have been most intensively investigated under the competition rules at EU level. So it's a core or focal sector for the European Commission. And there is also considerable enforcement at national level. European competition rules are enforced both by the European Commission's DG Competition and within a network of competition authority by national competition authorities. Pharmaceutical markets are particular because they're highly concentrated and capital intensive. Intellectual property rights play an important role, as well as regulatory protection such as orphan status, which confers temporary monopolies on specific products, which makes it more complicated from a competition point of view to address them. Sometimes there are over 100 patents on a single product. These can be molecular therapeutic, based on the molecular therapeutic substance, based on the process, or based on methods of application. And we also see strategic use of these patents by pharmaceutical companies to enter a process that's called evergreening, whereby they make sure that they're always protected by patents somehow by constantly extending their application. Another complicating factor is that consumers or patients often don't pay the price for drugs directly because they're reimbursed by national health systems or by health insurance. And also they don't select their own medicines because medicines are generally prescribed by doctors. And this means that consumers are not price sensitive and have very little choice over the medicines they use. And finally, although there is an EU licensing and access regime pharmaceutical purchasing markets are fragmented along national lines due to regulation and financing regimes. So you have a disconnect between different aspects of the regulatory framework. Given all this, it's possible to identify 4 stages of pharmaceutical competition as expressed here on the slide, which I have to read from left to right. So it starts with monopoly when there is a single patent for a specific treatment. Then you go to oligopoly when new patented drugs enter the market to treat the same illness. Then you get the 3rd phase of generic or biosimilar competition when patents expire, and you see the blue blocks here representing different producers of the same active substance competing with other patented medicines. And finally, you get to the stage of multi-source competition, where you have generic competition for various different substances. And for pharmaceutical companies, the point is to delay competition as long as possible. So they want to stay at the 1st phase as long as possible and delay progress onto the 4th phase, using evergreening, as I mentioned, and other anti-competitive strategies. And on the other hand, authorities want to progress from the 1st to the 4th phase as quickly as possible. And the objective is to attain multi-source competition, which promotes choice and drives down prices. Next slide, please. The application of the EU competition rules to pharmaceuticals is relatively recent. Initially, it was mainly about blocking firms blocking parallel imports from low price to high price markets, which fragmented the internal market. So that was something that was addressed. But the more modern phase of competition policy in pharmaceuticals started really with the 2005 AstraZeneca decision about the manipulation of the patent system to exclude generic competitors, so to make it more difficult for generic competitors to enter the market once patents expired. And this was a case that was confirmed by the European Court of Justice in 2012, and that, interestingly enough, reflects an approach that has been recently taken up by the Commission again in the Copaxone case, where again they're looking at manipulation of the patent system. So some people had predicted that following pay for delay cases, which we're about to discuss, they would switch possibly to excessive pricing cases, and I'm one of those people who predicted that, but we were wrong, and instead it seems they're looking at manipulation of the patent system more, as well as at disparagement, which we'll also discuss in a moment. Following the AstraZeneca case, the Commission launched a sector inquiry in 2008 and 2009, whereby they investigate the entire pharmaceutical sector with a focus on pay for delay or reverse settlement agreements. And these are agreements where incumbents bribe generic competitors to stay out of the market after the patents expire at the phase where the patents are contested or where it's not entirely clear whether they have expired or not. And what they do is they split their monopoly profits with the generics at the expense of the consumer. And could we briefly go to the next slide? This is shown here in the 3 images. At the top, you see the monopoly stage where the originator company, the patent holder, collects all the profits. And if we were to move to the competitive stage, we would see them having to split their profits with the generics. And because the generics can only enter the market by offering lower prices, the consumer also benefits in terms of lower prices. So the benefits are split 3 ways. And what pay for delay does is sharing the consumer benefits that would result from lower prices due to generic competition. By splitting its profits, the originator company bribes the generics to stay out of the market, and it gives them part of its monopoly profits in order for them to stay out of the market. It's generally something that occurs in the context of the settlement of patent disputes, and all kinds of tricks are tried in this context, such as fake licensing schemes, payment for supplies of raw materials, and marketing efforts that are never realized, etc. So, but effectively, what happens is there's a transfer of value from the originator to the generic company in exchange for not entering the market or entering the market at a later stage. It's called pay for delay. It's also characterized by reverse payments. So payment from the party claiming that its patents have been infringed to the party that is claimed to have infringed the patent, which is illogical. in a normal setting, but here can be explained by the fact that monopoly profits are split. Can I have the previous slide, please, again? So there have been a number of these cases listed here. Fentanyl, tivacephalon, the Lundbeck and Servier cases are the most important ones, where the Commission has imposed substantive fines on companies guilty of this kind of pay-for-delay behavior. And they've been fairly successful in prosecuting them, although it's taken a very long time to do so. But in recent cases, before the Court of Justice, first in the paroxetine case, which was a preliminary ruling, followed by the Lundbeck case at the court level, and by the opinion of the Advocate General in Servier, their approach has always been supported by the court. And what we're really waiting for now is the court's judgment in Servier to wrap things up. But it looks as if this is now established case law, and it provides a template for national competition authorities to follow, and the Commission is no longer so interested in pursuing pay-for-delay cases. And there are also fewer instances of pay-for-delay, so they appear to be successful in their policy of prosecuting them. Apart from setting up the sector inquiry followed by enforcement in specific cases, the Commission has set up a system of interaction between the European and national level, based on biannual European Competition Network working groups on pharmaceuticals in coordination with the national competition authorities, who've become increasingly active in this area. And there's a large number of antitrust decisions that's been taken at national level, with considerable fines and commitment decisions. At national level, the cases pursued have generally concerned disparagement and excessive pricing. Excessive pricing we'll discuss in some detail. Disparagement is essentially discouraging doctors from prescribing specific drugs because you cast doubt on their effectiveness, or you cast doubt on the fact whether they're safe or not for patients to use. They do that based on falsehoods, essentially misleading your counterparts about the quality of the drugs, and that's something that seems perhaps a little bit exotic, but in some member states like France and Italy, it's been an important branch of the case law, and now the Commission seems to have taken this up as well. The Copaxone case doesn't just concern misuse of the patent system, but also disparagement. And there's also a recent case on 5-4 Pharma where they're also looking at disparagement. So my guess would have been originally that following their pay-for-delay cases, they would look at excessive pricing. But that doesn't seem to be so much the case. Instead, the Commission is looking at things like abuse of the patent system and disparagement. Can I have move on 2 slides, please? Thank you. We've already discussed anti-competitive agreements to split the market, or divide the profits rather, in the pay-for-delay cases. The second important category of cases is one concerning excessive prices. That's one of exploitation of consumers. It's a species of unfair pricing, and as exploitation, it's a type of case that the Commission rarely takes up, because they prefer to focus on abuses of dominance that regard exclusion, because the idea is that if you manage to fight exclusion effectively, new competitors will enter the market, and that market entry in itself will protect consumers, and that they are worried that if you fight exploitation directly, you're going to discourage others from entering the market, and you're going to end up being a regulator. National authorities in the pharmaceuticals area have been less worried about this, or perhaps more realistic about the prospects of entry, and have pursued a number of excessive pricing cases, starting with the 2016 Aspen case in Italy, and most recently the Lydian case in the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain, and have been relatively successful so far in pursuing those cases. And the European Commission has followed on with one such case at a European level where they took over from the Italian authorities on, with regard to a number of anti-cancer drugs that had been priced at very high levels, and pursued a case in 26 member states, which they wrapped up not with an infringement decision, but a commitment decision that I'll say more about later. But that's so far the only excessive pricing case in pharmaceuticals at the European level, and it also appears that it will be the last one for a while, because as I've mentioned, they're focusing on other areas right now. The test used in this case is the United Brands test, which you see at the top of the slide. It's a two-part test. First, you have to prove excessiveness by looking at a price-cost comparison. So you want to look to see whether the profit levels are very high compared to, in the unfairness test, comparisons with products in competitive markets, or based on unfairness in itself. And that unfairness in itself can be based, for example, on price hikes that cannot be explained by changes in circumstances, or that perhaps are explicitly motivated by seeking excessive profits. The trend so far has been for such cases to focus on price hikes, so large price increases, sometimes into the thousands of percentage points, cases where consumers are locked in so they don't have a choice. These are in many cases niche generics, where there is a captive patient population with few alternatives. And so far there's been one orphan drug case, and that's the Leadiant case, which I'll also say more about in a moment. Next slide, please. To start with the Aspen case. This is a case that resulted in a commitment decision. So it's not a hard precedent based on a finding an infringement. Instead, there's a commitment decision where there is a quid pro quo. On the one hand, the company involved agrees to adjust its behavior, but on the other hand, it's not found to have infringed the competition rules, which also makes it protects it from private liability and damages claims. What happened here was, as you can see, and the red bars, prices went up spectacularly following the purchase by Aspen of a number of niche cancer treatments. Average prices increased immensely. A competition case was started, and commitments were reached in 2021, which were retroactive to 2019, which included two components. In the first place, there was a price decrease of, on average, 73% across the European Economic Area. In the second place, there were guarantees of supply or transfer of marketing authorizations. So it's a combination of a price cap that is EEA-wide and a guarantee of supplies. This is the conclusion of an investigation in 26 member states, apart from Italy. And the reason to conclude in this way is that it's difficult, I think. My interpretation of it is that it was difficult for the Commission to pursue the case in so many jurisdictions and get its and prove it in all those jurisdictions. And at the same time, it must have been an enormous drain on the capacity of DG Competition's pharma unit. And in exchange for cutting the case short, they obtained an EU-wide solution that they wouldn't have obtained if they had merely managed to impose a fine, and then the level of the resulting price would have been the result of a very long and tortuous process. It's similar to commitment decisions that were reached regarding Gazprom's excessive prices, and now in digital markets regarding Amazon self-preferencing. So it's a model for resolving competition cases that's used more often. The commitment decision is very extensive, though. It's more than 50 pages. It includes the technical specifics of the excessive pricing test. It specifies the theory of harm. For example, it expresses in terms of quality-adjusted life years lost to particular healthcare systems due to excessive prices, what the damages are. So as a result, I suppose we can be happy with it. Although as a precedent, it's not perfect, because it's not something that's going to go to the European Court of Justice and be confirmed there to give us an excessive pricing precedent that is more recent and more pertinent than the United Brands case, which dates back to 1973, I think. 1978, sorry, and regarded bananas. So it's possible to use it as a precedent, but it's difficult to do so in the details. Next slide, please. This graph shows the Lydian price increase, which is the orphan drug that I mentioned was prosecuted in a number of member states, including not just the Netherlands, but also Belgium, Italy, and Spain. In this case, it regards a drug that had been used for gallstones that it turned out could also be used to treat a rare debilitating metabolic disorder. It had been used off-label since the 1970s to good effect, but was subsequently, the rights were purchased and it was registered as an orphan drug based not on clinical trials, but on a sponsored literature review. And this meant that the Lydian drug was obtained a 10-year exclusivity based on prevalence, the prevalence criteria in the orphan drug regulation. So there was no original research, but there was a careful introduction strategy in order to maximize the price. And you see how the price per 100 capsules has moved over a relatively few years from 46 euros to 14,000 euros, leading to treatment costs of about 150,000 euros per patient per year. In the Netherlands and Belgium, doctors found an alternative based on pharmacy preparation, which means that hospital pharmacies are allowed to, as an exception to the EU regulatory rules on market access, are allowed to prepare their own drugs for their own patients, a process also called compounding. And this displaced the orphan product produced by Lydiant because it was much cheaper, but nevertheless, excessive pricing cases were launched against it. And in this context, it's more difficult to prosecute an excessive pricing case than when you're talking about a niche generic product that has been on the market for decades and where the relevant intellectual property rights have expired decades ago, because we're talking about a product that's still protected by orphan protection. And when you're looking at the cost-price ratio that you have to calculate as part of the United Brands test, you have to take into account investments in innovation, portfolio effects, and the probability of success. Although in this case, there was an absence of real innovation, and we did see price hikes that couldn't be explained by cost increases. So as an example of prosecution of an innovative drug, it's imperfect because the drug is not innovative, but as an example of a drug that benefits from regulatory protection, it is a good example. The outcomes in this case have been diverse. In Italy, there's been a regulatory compromise on price plus an excessive finding of excessive prices in 2022. In the Netherlands and in Spain, there's been a finding of excessive pricing, which is not yet definitive in the Netherlands because there is still a procedure of administrative review going on. And in Belgium, the case was closed because of the availability of the pharmacy preparation, which meant that the Belgian authority thought there wasn't a case to answer any longer. So it's the first example of an orphan drug subject to excessive pricing. And you can look on this alternatively as the beginning of a process where we will see protected drugs being prosecuted, or you could see it as the end point of a process and something that is really not that different from the previous cases looked at niche products, because there's an absence of real innovation here. Can I have the next slide, please? I just want to wrap up by going through some competition and non-competition remedies. What I mentioned at the beginning is that the pharmaceutical sector is highly specific for a number of reasons to do with the nature of the product. At the same time, it's also specific in competition law because it's the area where we find most prosecutions, and apart perhaps from digital markets, and where we find that there's a serious problem in the market with the balance between access to medicines and the promotion of innovation. In order to have an effective competition enforcement in this area, we therefore need to develop a framework where we can take innovation into account, and that's something that we've tried to do in the context of the Leadient case. And we may or may not have been successful in doing that. And this is an area where more, in particular, economic research is necessary. Another aspect that is relevant is that even where it's difficult to enforce the competition rules, I believe it's necessary to at least try enforcing them and push the boundaries where possible in order to reach either a satisfactory competition case or to prove that the competition rules are not sufficient to solve the problem and that regulatory solutions must therefore be examined. It's necessary for competition authorities to develop experience as well as a track record in order to become convincing vis-a-vis the companies. And also, I think they should use their full toolbox, including the use of compulsory licensing, or at least considering the use of compulsory licensing, because that has the advantage of allowing other companies to enter the market. So it means that it may be heavy-handed to impose compulsory licensing, but you don't then have to go on to regulate the prices, because presumably the competitive process will take care of the pricing process itself once other licensed companies have entered the market. I think it's necessary to promote responsive enforcement that reflects the reaction of the companies involved and imposes commensurate measures. Well-meaning companies need guidance and consultation, and those that are incorrigible probably need to be removed from the market or need to suffer from a compulsory license in order for competition to be imposed on them, and all the other relevant steps are sketched out in between in the enforcement pyramid that I've set out on the slide. Private enforcement will also probably come to play an important role, where private parties can claim damages once competition infringements have been proven. This is something that hasn't happened in practice very much yet, but especially in the UK in recent cases, this has become a feature. Competition enforcement needs to be complementary with non-competition remedies. We need better regulation. I think my colleagues here today are talking about ways in which that might be achieved. We need probably need public price intervention, which can take various shapes. External reference pricing or price caps based on purchasing power parity, managed conditional entry agreements for medicines to enter reimbursement systems, and horizon scanning to make sure that we are aware ahead of time of what is coming towards us. And in addition, we need to promote competition for the market, which can take various shapes. There can be tendering, preferential sourcing, and joint purchasing initiatives, some of which have already occurred both at national level and between member states. And what we need is a combination of all these remedies and not just one or a few of them, because the problems in this area are sufficiently large that they are not going to be solved by one or two solutions, but we need a combination. With that, I would like to wrap up, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Wolf, for a very interesting overview and introduction to EU competition law and pharmaceuticals, and some food for thought there, as also from Aurélie and Éloïse's discussion as well. Just before we move on to Dr. Katrina Perehudoff's presentation, I'd just like to invite the audience to feel free to post any questions in the chat, and we'll pick these up to read out if you don't feel you want to sort of take the floor yourself. So on that note, over to Dr. Katrina Perehudoff to tell us about the pharmaceutical strategy and challenges for the EU's role in global health. Katrina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Great to be with you today. I just want to check, is my internet okay? Sound, is that fine?
Yeah. We can hear
Great.
you fine. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, next slide, please. I'll be speaking about the EU's pharmaceutical strategy in relation to the EU's role in global health. And given the topic, just wanted to mention I don't have any financial or other interests in the pharmaceutical industry or health industries. And my research is funded by public organizations like the Dutch Science Council and the European Commission. Thank you. Next slide. So I'm in this short presentation, I'm essentially looking at 3 possible challenges to ensuring a strong EU voice globally in pharmaceuticals, which is one of the EU's stated objectives in this policy. And the conceptual question I ask is, why should the EU have a strong voice globally? What is its own idea about this? What is the potential rationale under that objective? The second is what I call a theoretical question. So how will the EU achieve its aims globally? Which pathways does it see it will use? And the third question is a more empirical, looking at exactly what will the EU do with regards to pharmaceuticals, and maybe if we can go as far to say access to medicines for people outside of the EU's borders. Next slide, please. So if we start with the conceptual problem, why should the EU have a strong voice globally? I've taken a long read of the EU's pharmaceutical policy, and I know many of you in the room today have as well. So I'm curious to actually just put these ideas out there and get a sense from you whether you're seeing some of the same things I am, or if you see things differently. I'd be interested to know that afterwards. Anyways, why should the EU have a strong voice in pharmaceuticals? Well, what is very clear in this policy is that it's a tool for investment, a strong, fair, competitive, and green industry in Europe. And the policy, of course, underscores the importance of performing well, the single market performing well for pharmaceuticals. And it notes, of course, the strategic economic importance of the pharma sector for all of Europe. And the idea that it wants to position Europe in a strong position globally. And so it's, of course, given the EU's competences and fundamental freedoms, it's no surprise that there is a strong emphasis on maximizing economic development and industrial competitiveness in this policy. Next slide, please. However, I also considered other frames of global health policy. One of those frames is health security. So in other words, we have a self-interest in maintaining our own health security within Europe's borders, and that's why we should care about and help people get access to medicines, usually for infectious diseases in other parts of the world, in order to protect Europe's borders and the health within Europe's borders. That's the rationale. And in this policy, of course, there's references to EU's preparedness and resilience against cross-border health threats, and focus on different EU agencies. It also looks at strategic dependencies that Europe currently has and how it can develop its strategic autonomy in those areas with regards to supply chains and stockpiling. And there's, of course, a reference to antimicrobial resistance and the fact that it's a global problem, not only a European problem. So in this sense, I'd say that there's a focus on health security frames in this policy. Of course, we were to expect that coming out of COVID. It's somewhat vague whether that health security matters only in the eyes of the EU, only for EU citizens, or more globally. I'd say that's an open question. Next slide, please. Another frame I looked for is a social justice frame. So underlying the human rights of every individual, and that they, out of the nature of their human dignity, those human rights deserve respect, and there's a basic minimum that everybody should be entitled to. And these references were clear in identifying needs of patients across the EU and needs that were unmet. However, they were not that obvious for the sort of global social justice perspective. I didn't see any sort of references to human rights or to the needs of people beyond Europe. That was, if they're there, it's very muted. Next slide, please. And the final frame I looked at the final frames I looked at were more cosmopolitan, so looking at the frame of doing no harm, which Thomas Bogie has suggested. So this is the idea that historically the EU and its institutions and its dealings in the world have in some ways damaged access to medicines in low and middle income countries. And so it's important that the EU ensure that its actions, in fact, do no harm with regards to medicines beyond its borders. And another frame would be more of a global health justice frame. So the cosmopolitan idea that the EU should show solidarity with individuals needing medicines outside the EU as well as within the EU. And very clear references to both of these frames were missing in my eyes, but maybe you've seen something different. Next slide, please. So moving on to the theoretical question of when reading this policy, how will the EU achieve its aims globally? And here I would look at three pathways of potential EU influence on medicines beyond its borders: unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral. Next slide, please. So the unilateral pathway is one where I would describe it as basically the EU is sort of minding its own business, regulating its own internal pharmaceutical market without the explicit intention of influencing what's going on beyond that market, and still the EU's actions on its own market are having ripple effects in other parts of the world. And here I say it's missing, but actually I would rephrase it. I would just say it's muted. It's muted. I see it in one place in a reference to the Article 58 procedure, where basically the EMA offers to use its expertise in evaluating medicines that would be intended to be marketed exclusively on markets outside Europe. So not for market authorization, but just to provide that advice and an opinion to regulators in third countries to use for their own purposes. And there is an explicit reference to that. And that the EU, well, what the EMA's found is that this mechanism hasn't been widely used since it's been implemented. So they want to make it more appealing. But I didn't see any references to the EU's own recognition that its regulatory standards and decisions are being used in other parts of the world. So there's 13, just by way of example, there's 13 Latin American regulators that actually have changed their laws to rely on the EU's approvals of medicines when regulating their own local markets. And that's affecting like 380 million people in those markets in Latin America. That's a huge impact that the EU is having normatively through the act of just regulating its own market. And this sort of regulatory reliance, it's mentioned, but not explicitly in, and it certainly doesn't go into the detail of thinking about the potential influence or impact on third countries. Next slide, please. So the bilateral pathway is one in which the EU engages its trade, its accession, and its aid agendas with third countries to influence access to medicines. There's a big focus on trade, in fact, where the Commission says it will defend the EU's interests and in particular look for access to procurement markets in third countries and other common areas of strategic interest, throwing in an example of technology transfer that is not that well developed in the policy itself. At the very beginning of the policy, it recognizes that the strategy is relevant for potential candidate countries to join the EU, but it doesn't dive into detail in any place which parts might be particularly relevant and which existing programs those candidate countries could already be benefiting from or participating in or observing as part of that process, such as joint procurement of medical countermeasures. And I don't see any references to the EU's aid work and how it plays a role in standard setting for medicines provided through humanitarian actions. Next slide, please. And then finally, I look at multilateralism in the EU and how it perceives its role on the world stage. And there, it does mention several times regulatory cooperation, convergence, and capacity, and mainly working with other partners at the ICH or with the WHO or with basically, larger multilateral entities. To encourage reliance, although here it says to encourage reliance on WHO rather than the EU, so it was kind of interesting in that sense. When it comes to multilateralism, the EU also heavily mentions the World Trade Organization, engaging with those members, complying with those rules, and different WTO actions, and that's perhaps not surprising because the EU is a member of the WTO, but we certainly don't see those kind of references to engaging with WHO. And again, there the EU has a more coordinational role because it is not a member state of the WHO, and instead acts, I guess, indirectly through the EU member states. Next slide, please. So the final question I ask is empirically, what will the EU do? What are some practical examples of how it sees fulfilling its role on the world stage? Next slide, please. So it does spend quite a lot of attention looking at regulatory standard setting and common international standards, where it promotes convergence, but rather than through specific reliance, more in these international fora. And what struck me is that the EU encourages a move towards a more ambitious level of quality, efficacy, and safety standards. And I'm kind of struck for why this is needed, given the current level of the EU's standards that it applies, and that those standards are taken and also shaped together with the ICH. So what is this continuous drive to the top? Is there not a threshold that should be met? And once it's met, we paying for a higher quality of medicines, for example, is maybe not always in the best interests of third countries. Rather, more and transparent information about how efficacious or safe medicines are would be preferable. And another aspect of regulatory standard setting is that the EU really frames itself as a leader in setting the agenda for preparing and updating guidelines for regulatory harmonization, which is interesting considering global dynamics and coloniality and other aspects of engaging with third countries. Next slide, please. And then finally, another example of an empirical challenge is that the EU sets out for itself is technology transfer, where it says, hey, Africa is an important partner who we should explore cooperation with on technology transfer. And arguably, the whole COVID-19 vaccine debacle is a prime example of where technology transfer really is what was needed to scale up global manufacturing, and that seems like a missed opportunity. So on one hand, excellent that it's in the policy, but I would really like to see this spelled out and to understand the dynamics of this cooperation with the African continent, what the EU sees its role being, and how meaningful technology transfer can actually take place, such that people on other continents also have access to medicines they need. Next slide, please. Great. Maybe I forgot I can sum up just with a few key messages. Basically, my reading of the EU's pharmaceutical policy is that it focused on certain frames around investment and less so around health security and social justice or global health justice more specifically. And because certain frames were chosen and other frames weren't, that determines how the EU sees its engagement with third countries. And that can also be why we see this heavy focus on trade at the bilateral and multilateral levels and on regulatory convergence, but little attention for a sort of win-win situation that would involve technology transfer to third countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Katrina. Thank you to the speakers for bearing with a very sensitive touchpad that I've had on my laptop this afternoon. So I'll just stop sharing the slides in a minute. So now we want to think about in terms of questions and answers for our panel. And I'll just stop sharing slides and be able to see the chat, hopefully. Okay, we seem to have some good comments here. Okay, so we have a question. I don't know if the panel can see the chat or not. If not, I can read it out for the audience as well. From I hope I'm getting this right. Velislav Kirilov, who has a question regarding the EU of competition as a tool for stimulating pharmaceutical innovation. In particular, he's interested whether current unilateral conduct rules in the EU are capable of tackling anti-competitive conduct by one originator towards another at the stage of research and development, competition for future markets. Such practices may potentially amount to blocking patenting or refusals to deal. I don't think, however, there are yet such precedents at EU level. Can I invite thoughts from the panel on this? I'm getting a sense this is mainly directed at Wolf, but I'm very happy for anyone to jump in for this one.
I'm not aware of any precedents either in this area, and it would have to depend on the facts of the case, which type of theory of harm is most appropriate. So it may well be a refusal to deal setting. I've no way of knowing without having more specifics. The balance between competition and innovation is, of course, always crucial when applying the competition rules in this area. And we do see a movement forward in the production chain, especially in the area of mergers, where the Commission is becoming increasingly critical of pipeline products being closed off, and where it's becoming increasingly proactive and forward-looking. So I do see a trend there, but in terms of dominance abuse or anti-competitive agreements, I couldn't comment.
Would anyone else on the panel like to say anything about whether or not competition has come into your areas of focus as well? I think in the strategy there was some connection being drawn between, perhaps by enhancing competition, this may have benefits in delivering other aims of the strategy. Also, I'd just like to ask the audience if there are any other questions. Feel free to sort of raise your hands or turn on your cameras if you wish, or pop questions in the chat.
Well, if I may, I've seen Katrina's question in the chat. So thank you, Katrina, for the question. So we had in our joint statement about the external EU external competences. We talked about it a little bit, but we had only just a couple of recommendations. but not that much. We had a first recommendation to, of course, improve and promote a continuous dialogue, that's for sure. And the rest was rather on IP incentives in the role of the EU in that area. And if I may also react on your presentation, I found interesting because it resonated, because I was reading the other day the new regulation on cross-border health threats, and they took on exactly those words that you highlighted about the dialogue with the WHO and how the EU would make sure that the international health regulation would be applied, at least at the EU level and in its member states. And this is something that is now in the actual regulation. I think the regulation was adopted in November, published probably in December, I don't remember, but definitely kept that in one of the regulations.
Thanks, Éloïse. Katrina, sorry.
I think Katrina also asked me a question whether the fines for anti-competitive practices are directed to national social security bodies. So whether they would benefit from any fines that are imposed as a result of competition procedures. And the answer is no, they're not. They go into the general budget of the European Union. At national level, something similar happens. But also the fines are meant to discourage future behavior and or reflect a punishment for past behavior, but they're not intended as compensation. For that, we have private enforcement, so you are able to sue for damages. You would be able to do that as a national social security body as well. And I believe that in the United Kingdom, several insurers have started such procedures based on previous excessive pricing findings in the UK. And it's a trend that is only just starting, but I'm sure will be taking off. So there's another route for that. It's not directly the fine, but it's damages that you can claim.
Fascinating. Thank you both.
Sorry, if I can react as well. To complete what Éloïse has said, to answer Katrina's question, in the joint statement, we also highlight for the dialogue to reflect upon it was more on the impact to really reflect on the impact of the EU regulatory EU regulation on really the availability of pharmaceutical in third countries. And we also suggest, but I don't know how it could be done, to contribute more through building manufacturing capacity outside Europe. And in that sense, we were meaning really in low and middle income countries. And if I may, Katrina, I was wondering, following your presentation, which was really great, I've been wondering whether, so what you presented, it was what you have seen from the analysis of the policy documents. So you mean the strategy itself and other policy documents, or only the strategy? Only the strategy? And so I've been wondering, when regarding the topics you found and the elements you found, I was thinking there is no, regarding the what you say, the unilateral pathway is muted. I was thinking about the the joint, there are joint scientific advice from the European Medicine Agency and other regulatory agencies, and I think that these are really ways of promoting the EU model globally. And but I know this, it doesn't appear, I think, within the strategy, but there are still many tools developed by the European Medicine Agency, and but already it is already done, not in the strategy, but yeah, was thinking about this one.
Yeah, that's indeed a good example. The Article 58 procedure. But I think the EMA, at least in the discussions I've had there, they're a bit disappointed with how it's been used so far, and that it's not been very popular, and it's unclear exactly what some countries do with the information afterwards, if it actually leads to more authorizations. And yeah, that's all.
Okay, so that was also the second part of the question. So I didn't know that it was not really popular and whether it was used or not at all. We don't know. We have some data on whether it is used, but not on, so not so much used. And then when it is used, whether it has really an impact on having the product in both or several markets. That's really the question. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we have another question in the chat. This is from Emanuele Sister. So this is for Katrina. What about the relevant recommendation issued by the EDQM Council of Europe, for example, with regard to the use of extemporaneous preparations to face medicine shortages?
Yeah, great question, but short answer. I don't know. I haven't looked deeply into issues around quality, and nor around the Council of Europe. I'm starting off this project actually this January, so I look forward to looking into that.
Okay, thank you for your question, Emanuele. Can I just ask if there's any last questions before the end of the session?
I'm afraid I'm being kicked out of this room. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, no
I
problem.
need to leave. I apologize, but I'll turn my camera off and keep listening.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katrina.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I think if there's no more questions, we'll start to bring this webinar to a close. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Katrina Perehudoff, Professor Wolf Sauter, Dr. Éloïse Gennet, and Dr. Aurélie Mahalatchimy for taking time to talk to us this afternoon about different perspectives on EU pharmaceutical activity and the EU pharmaceutical strategy. There will be a sort of written write-up from this discussion to follow on the EU Health Governance website. Do keep an eye on what we have planned for 2023, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much.